Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, a title held, of course, by his late father, Prince Philip, for more than 70 years. It had been the late Prince's wish for Prince Edward to be granted the dukedom after his death.
There are moments inside the British monarchy that never reach the public in their full form. Moments that are scrubbed clean before they become headlines, smoothed over before they become scandal, buried before they become history. But every so often, something happens that cannot be fully contained. A legal document surfaces. A private letter gets confirmed. A decision made years ago by a dying queen suddenly becomes the most important piece of paper inside Buckingham Palace. And when that happens, the entire carefully constructed image of royal unity begins to crack at the edges. What has unfolded inside the House of Windsor in recent months is exactly that kind of moment. It began quietly, as most royal battles do, behind closed doors, through intermediaries, through carefully worded communications that never say directly what they actually mean. But by early 2026, it had become something that could no longer be handled quietly. Prince Edward, Duke of Edinburgh, had retained a legal team. Senior property lawyers had been briefed. Documents had been gathered, organized, and prepared for delivery. And when that delivery came, it did not arrive as a conversation or a request or even a warning. It arrived as a statement of fact, a file placed on a table inside the Crown Estate offices that said, in effect, this matter is settled. And it was settled long before any of you decided to challenge it. To understand why that moment carried the weight it did, you have to understand who Prince Edward is within the context of the modern monarchy. He is the youngest child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. He spent decades in a position that was never quite clearly defined. He worked in television production in the 1990s. He married Sophie Rhys-Jones in 1999 in a ceremony that was notably quieter than the grand royal weddings of his brothers before him. He stepped back from a military career that had been expected of him, which created tension with his father at the time. And for years, he occupied a space in the royal structure that was real but not central. He was working, present, loyal, but never at the top of the conversation. What kept him steady through all of that was something the public rarely saw clearly. He had the trust of his mother. Queen Elizabeth II had a long memory and a clear eye for character. She watched all of her children navigate their roles, their marriages, their public lives, and their failures. And she made quiet decisions based on what she observed over decades. One of those decisions involved the Duke of Edinburgh title, the title that had defined Prince Philip for more than 70 years, the title that was so closely associated with her husband that it carried a weight unlike almost any other in the family. When she decided that title would pass to Edward upon Philip's death, it was not a casual gesture. It was a deliberate act of recognition. She was saying something specific about who she trusted to carry that legacy. That title was officially granted by King Charles III in April 2023. But the decision behind it had already been locked in place years before that moment. And connected to that title, as Elizabeth had made clear through a signed letter of intent, was Bagshaw Park, the estate in Surrey that had been Edward and Sophie's family home for more than 2 decades. That connection was not accidental or informal. It was deliberate. The letter, witnessed by Prince Philip in his final months, was designed to ensure that the title and the estate remained together, that the one gave the other meaning, and that no future pressure from inside the institution could separate them. But by 2025 and into 2026, pressure was exactly what was being applied. The palace under King Charles III had been moving toward what it described publicly as modernization. That word covers a great deal. It covers cost reviews. It covers property audits. It covers decisions about which royal households receive support and which are restructured. In practice, what it meant for Edward and Sophie was that Bagshaw Park had been placed under review. The language was institutional. The framing was financial. But the target was clear. An estate valued at approximately £30 million, sitting inside Windsor Great Park, legally occupied by the Duke of Edinburgh under a long-term lease, was being examined by people who had a financial interest in recovering it. What made Edward's position more complicated than it might appear from the outside was the history of how he came to hold that estate in the first place. When Bagshot Park was handed to him under a lease signed in March 1998, it was not a prize. It was a responsibility. The building had been neglected for years after the army chaplain who had previously occupied it moved out. The Crown Estate had seriously considered converting it into a hotel or a conference facility. It had no obvious royal future. Edward took it on with a clear set of conditions. He would pay rent. He would fund the restoration. He would turn it into a functioning royal residence. And he did exactly that. He invested more than £1 million of his own private money into the restoration. The total cost of repairs reached nearly £3 million. Once the work was completed, his annual rent was raised to £90,000, which the National Audit Office confirmed reflected market value. He paid his dues. He followed the terms. He held up every part of the agreement. In 2007, he went further. Through a private company, he paid £5 million to extend the lease to 150 years. That was not a short-term arrangement. That was a lifetime commitment to a property he had restored and maintained at considerable personal cost. Within the terms of that extended lease, he held the right to sell the lease and retain the profit. He had built genuine legal ownership around that home over a period of nearly 30 years. And now, in 2026, the institution that had taken his money under those terms, that had accepted his rent, that had benefited from his investment, was attempting to use its own internal review process to challenge what he held. When Edward's lawyers delivered their file to the Crown Estate offices, it contained 3 layers of evidence that built a case that was, by any legal standard, extraordinarily strong. The first layer was the original lease documentation, every signed agreement, every payment record, every communication confirming the terms under which he had occupied and invested in Bagshot Park. The second layer was Queen Elizabeth's letter of intent, witnessed by Philip, connecting the estate to the Edinburgh title and making clear that her wish was for that connection to be permanent for Edward's lifetime and for a defined period beyond it. The third layer was 2 decades of maintenance records proving that he had continued to honor the terms of his agreement and that his stewardship of the property had saved the Crown Estate significant money that would otherwise have been required for upkeep. The legal assessment that followed, conducted by the Crown's own team, reached a conclusion that must have been uncomfortable to deliver. The Duke of Edinburgh's position was, in the words of those familiar with the findings, virtually unbreakable. No royal order could override what had been legally established. The investment had been made. The lease had been extended. The letter had been witnessed. The rent had been paid at market value. Every element that would be required to challenge his claim was absent. Every element that would be required to defend it was present. The king had believed, for reasons that may have made sense to him personally but did not hold up legally, that granting the title gave him continued control over what came with it. His own lawyers told him in writing that it did not. But the legal battle over Bagshot Park was only one dimension of what had become a much broader conflict. Earlier in 2026, before the lawyers delivered their dossier, a separate and deeply personal confrontation had already begun. An official from the office of Queen Camilla had arrived at the Edinburgh household representing what was described as a routine jewelry audit, a heritage review, a standard institutional process. The framing was bureaucratic. The intention was not. At the center of the audit was the anthem tiara, a piece of jewelry that carried a significance far beyond its monetary value. The anthem tiara was not a loan from the royal collection. It was not a piece held in trust for the monarchy. It was commissioned specifically by Queen Elizabeth II for Sophie's wedding in June 1999. It was designed using 4 antique elements in a honeysuckle pattern taken from the private collection of Queen Victoria. And critically, it was given to Sophie not as a state asset, but as a personal wedding gift. For nearly 25 years, it had been Sophie's. It was the piece she wore more than any other. It was the piece most closely associated with her public image as a senior working royal. It was, in every meaningful sense, hers. The argument being made through the audit was that because the tiara incorporated materials with roots in the Victorian royal collection, it could be reclassified as crown property. Under that reclassification, it would be held in the central royal vault and issued to Sophie only for approved official appearances. She would need to ask permission to wear her own wedding gift. She would lose the quiet dignity of ownership over something that had been placed in her hands by the woman she considered closest to a mother. Edward's legal team responded with documentation that closed the argument immediately. A deed of gift signed by Queen Elizabeth II in 1999 stated explicitly that the anthem tiara was a private wedding present, not a state loan, not a shared asset, not a piece held in trust for the institution. A gift, owned privately, beyond institutional reach. The same lawyers also pointed to an additional detail that strengthened the case further. In 1999, Edward had worked with royal jewelers to commission a matching set of pearl jewelry for Sophie, a necklace and earrings designed specifically to complement the anthem tiara. The design rights for that set were held by Edward personally. His legal team argued that the tiara and the pearl set formed a single artistic unit connected to his own creative work. You could not reclassify one element without disrupting the integrity of the whole, and that gave him an additional and entirely separate basis for challenging the audit. There was a history behind this kind of move that made it land harder than it might otherwise have done. After Princess Diana died, a diamond and emerald necklace that had been given to her by the Queen Mother on her wedding day was returned to the royal vault. It later reappeared redesigned into a brooch worn publicly by Camilla. The reaction to that had been swift and lasting. The memory of it had never fully faded. And now, watching a similar pattern emerge around Sophie's tiara, that memory returned for many of those who were paying attention. A personal gift given by a queen to a woman she trusted was being reached for by institutional hands. The reasoning was different. The paperwork was different. But the shape of what was happening was familiar enough to cause real alarm. By the afternoon of March 25, 2026, Edward's team delivered a direct warning. If the audit claim on the tiara was not formally dropped by end of day, they would release private letters written by Queen Elizabeth II. Letters that confirmed her explicit wish for Sophie to retain full personal ownership of her private jewelry. According to those close to the situation, those letters contained more than property instructions. They contained Elizabeth's own words about Camilla, words that reflected the long, complicated, and never fully resolved tension that had existed between the two women throughout Elizabeth's reign. Charles had spent years and considerable institutional effort rebuilding Camilla's public image. Those letters, if released, could have undone a significant portion of that work in a single news cycle. It was into this atmosphere, already charged with legal filings, formal audits, deadline warnings, and the threat of released private correspondence, that Princess Anne walked. Her arrival at Buckingham Palace on the afternoon of March 25th changed the nature of the confrontation entirely, and does not soften her words or adjust her positions for comfort. She is widely regarded inside the family and among those who work around her as the most direct and least performative senior royal. What she says is what she means. What she commits to, she follows through on. And Sophie had not always been close. As recently as 2021, their relationship carried a noticeable formality. But Philip's death in April of that year changed the internal geography of the family. Both women stepped forward to support the Queen in her final period. They spent time together in ways they had not before. A genuine connection formed. One built not on protocol, but on shared experience, shared grief, and a shared sense of what mattered. By the time of Elizabeth's funeral in September 2022, it was visible to anyone watching. As they waited for the coffin to be carried in, Sophie placed a quiet hand on Anne's back. That small gesture said something real about where they had arrived together. When Anne walked into her meeting with Charles, she did not come as a mediator. She came as someone who had already reviewed the Bagshot Park documents thoroughly, understood the legal position in detail, and had reached her own clear conclusion. She told the king directly that if he allowed the challenges to continue, if he allowed his mother's signed documents to be treated as negotiable, he would be destroying the credibility of royal authority itself. Her argument was not sentimental. It was structural. A monarch's word carries weight because it has always carried weight, because every signature of every sovereign before the current one has been honored. undermine, and the current king's own authority begins to erode from its foundation. She then delivered a statement that those present described as stopping the room. If their mother's signature on a deed of gift or a lease was not worth the paper it was written on today, then Charles's own signature would be worth even less tomorrow. That was not a rhetorical point. That was a constitutional argument delivered in plain language inside a private meeting. It was the kind of clarity that cannot be easily dismissed or delayed. And also addressed the children. There had been quiet pressure building around James, Earl of Wessex, and Lady Louise Windsor, pressure directed at moving them earlier than planned into fully private status, which would strip away the protections and support structures that came with their current position, and made clear that this decision belonged to Edward and Sophie and to the children themselves when they were old enough to make it meaningfully. It was not a decision for anyone outside that family unit to push or accelerate, and had made the same decision for her own children, Peter and Zara, decades earlier. But that had been her choice, made freely, made on her own terms. What she was observing now was something different. It was institutional pressure dressed up as modernization policy, and she was not going to allow it to proceed. She also raised the possibility of a full public audit of the Queen's household expenses if the pressure on the Edinburgh family continued, and has the standing, the reputation, and the institutional credibility to make that kind of threat real. She has spent decades operating with a level of financial discipline and public accountability that is rarely matched in the royal family. If she said she would pursue an audit, it would be taken seriously by everyone in the room. And the implication was clear. An audit that broad, conducted by someone with Anne's thoroughness, would not necessarily reflect well on every household it examined. By the evening of March 25, 2026, the outcome had been decided. A formal note was sent from the office of the Master of the Jewel House to Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. It confirmed in writing that the anthem tiara would remain under her exclusive private control. No audit, no reclassification, no central vault, hers. At the same time, the review of Bagshot Park was formally closed. The official language described it as an acknowledgement of the Edinburgh household's contribution to maintaining the estate. Inside the palace, no one misread what that language meant. The crown had put its position on paper, and the position was retreat. Everything Edward held was confirmed in writing. The dukedom, the estate, the tiara, all of it exactly where Queen Elizabeth II had placed it. And that confirmation was not merely a resolution of a specific dispute. It was a record. It entered the archive. It will remain there. And what it shows, beyond the specific details of leases and deeds and witness letters, is something more fundamental. A claim was made against what a queen had given. The claim failed. The institution that made it was forced to acknowledge that failure in official written form. The cost of that outcome, however, is not measured only in legal documents. The relationship between King Charles III and Prince Edward has been permanently altered. It will not return to what it was. They will stand together at public engagements. They will present the appearance of a functioning royal family. But everyone inside that family will know what happened. They will know that Edward had to retain lawyers to protect himself from his own brother. They will know that Philip witnessed a letter specifically because he foresaw a moment like this one and wanted his youngest son protected from it. They will know that Elizabeth's final decisions were challenged and that the challenge required legal resistance to defeat. There is now a visible division inside the monarchy between two distinct centers of thinking. Around Buckingham Palace, Charles and Camilla continue to pursue a vision of a tighter, more centrally controlled royal structure. Outside that center, a different alignment has formed. Princess and Edward and Sophie, joined by quiet support from the Prince and Princess of Wales, are holding a different line. They are not doing it loudly. They are not giving interviews or releasing statements. But they are holding it. And the result of what happened on March 25th, 2026, has made that line more visible and more fixed than it has ever been before. For James, Earl of Wessex, who will one day carry the dukedom of Edinburgh, this moment will form part of the foundation of his understanding of how the institution operates. He watched his father refuse to give ground not through aggression or public confrontation, but through preparation, patience, and the careful accumulation of evidence over many years. He watched a legal file placed on a table defeat a royal challenge that had been building for months. He watched the crown back down in writing. That is not a lesson that teaches uncomplicated loyalty to the institution. It is a lesson that teaches something more complicated and more useful, that the institution can both give and attempt to take back. That preparation is protection, that the documents you keep and the agreements you honor matter enormously when the pressure finally comes. Charles has his monarchy. He has restructured it. He has reduced it. He has shaped it around his own vision of what it should be in the 21st century. But what he does not have, and what he cannot recover through any legal process or institutional review, is the undivided trust of the brother who gave decades of quiet service, who paid his own way, who asked for nothing except to keep what had been given to him with full legal backing, and the personal blessing of the two people whose judgment mattered most inside that family. That is what the lawyers confirmed on March 25, 2026. Not just a lease, not just a tiara, not just a title. They confirmed that what Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip gave to Edward and Sophie cannot be taken back. They confirmed it in the face of a challenge from the palace itself. And they confirmed it in writing permanently for the archive, for the future, for the historical record that will outlast every one of the people involved in this dispute. The palace was shocked. The result was not supposed to go this way, but it did, and it cannot be undone.